Today we're going to talk about troubleshooting error codes on the G500 series VFDs. In the video description below, we'll type out a summary for your convenience as well. So let's get started. A few things you should do when you get an error code with your G500. First, you should write it down so that you remember what code it is before you reset the drive. Remember what happened when the drive tripped. For example, like how long before it tripped, what speed did it trip at, things like that. And then you should check your parameter settings and wiring. So often, it is one of those two things. We've talked to many customers over and over, and very often, it is one of those two things. I know we often think we did it right, but let's double check it anyway. So try to figure out what's wrong before resetting the drive, because if you trip the drive too many times, it could damage the drive. Now, if you're new at VFDs and not sure what you're doing, we would highly recommend that you hire a certified electrician to troubleshoot your issue. You can also call your distributor or us for support as well. And safety should be your #1 concern. Now, if you decided to give it a go, you can check the error code section in your manual, which is chapter 7.5 and page 255, depending which version of the book you have. And right there in 7.5, you can see the full list of all the error codes that you may encounter. And after that, in section 7.6, you can see different troubleshooting sequences. These flowcharts are pretty useful to help you diagnose what's wrong with your drive. Now, before we get started, let's talk about safety. You should always wear proper PPE when you're working with electricity. You should only troubleshoot when the drive is off and discharged. You can wait 10 to 15 minutes after the drive is turned off for it to discharge, or use a meter to measure the voltage on the negative and positive bus just to be sure. Do not touch a live terminal unless you have proper PPE. Always remember that. Okay, let's look at the most common error codes that you will see. The first one we'll talk about is OC, which is overcurrent. The codes would be OC1, OC2, or OC3. This is due to short circuit or overload. So what do you do when you get these codes? First, you should measure your motor and cables to make sure there's no short circuit. Number 2, you should check your parameters, particularly in group P02 for motor information. Double check your horsepower, amps, voltage, RPM, and make sure you have entered the values correctly according to your motor nameplate. Now, if you have done all that and they're correct, you're probably getting too much torque from the motor. That means your motor is overloaded or your motor is accelerating too quickly. So you can slow down the acceleration by changing parameter P00.11. The second error code we'll talk about is overvoltage. The codes are OV1, OV2, and OV3. What do you do here? Again, check your P02 parameters and make sure you program correctly. The second thing you could check is making sure the incoming voltage is within the required rating of your VFD. If those both look good, there's probably power coming back from the motor and it's going to the utility. So for example, what could cause that? Maybe you have a fan and you're slowing down too fast and the power is being pushed back to the line. And how do you resolve that? You can slow down the deceleration by increasing the value in parameter P00.12. And if you have something like a downhill conveyor or elevator, you might need to install resistor on the DC bus. The third error code we'll talk about is undervoltage, which is UV. Again, check the parameter group P02 to make sure you have programmed everything correctly. Then you can measure the voltage and make sure it is within the rated voltage of the VFD. Now after that, it could get a little tricky because you just have to figure out what causes the undervoltage. The fourth error code we'll talk about is overload, which is OL1 and OL2. Check parameter group P02, particularly the horsepower and voltage setting. Now the motor you have might be too small and is underrated for your application. In that case, you just have to get a different motor. The second possible explanation is that your motor is running too slow and the motor fan is not spinning fast enough to prevent overheating. You can program the drive to bypass it, or you can increase the run speed. The fifth error code we'll talk about is SPI, which is input phase loss. Make sure all 3 phases are attached properly. Check if there are loose wires or if they're connected to the wrong phase. And that's all there is to it. The next error code is SPO, which is output phase loss. If you get this code, check the wires to the motors, make sure the connection is tight. Now, if everything looks good, it's possible that your motor has failed, so you want to test your motor to isolate your issues. Meter each leg and make sure they have the same current. The seventh error code we'll talk about is overheating, which is OH1 and OH2. This one is pretty obvious. The drive is running too hot. So first, check the VFD fans, make sure they're still running. Then check the ambient temperature, make sure it's not too hot for the drive. If it is too hot, you might have to add a fan or AC. If the drive is in an enclosure, make sure there's airflow to the drive as well. The last error code we'll talk about is ground fault, which is ETH1 and ETH2. This means one of the three output phases is going to ground. It could be your cable insulation failing, or your motor failing, or something is touching ground in the motor conduit box. What do you do when you get ETH1 or 2? You should disconnect all the phases and run a high pot test to tell which phase is grounded. Do not do the high pot test with the phases connected. You will damage the VFD. So these are some of the most common error codes that we get asked about. If you're getting a code that's not one of these, feel free to check out the troubleshooting section in the book and see if you can help yourself. If not, you can always contact your distributor or contact us for help. Remember, always wear your PPE when working with live power. Thanks for watching. Feel free to check out our channel for other videos, and we'll see you next time.